Well, today I have our friend of the program on A Neighbor's Choice, a retired CIA veteran and a person who's been covering the war situation, what's going on in Ukraine, Larry C. Johnson. How you doing, sir?
I am well, Dave. How are you?
Doing well, and it's always great to hear your insights. Your blog is sonar21.com, and your latest post. I thought we'd just start off right with that about how the West does a backflip on Bakhmut's strategic importance. I've been following the Bakhmut story for some time, and that was supposed to be a big deal, a rallying point, and yet now the narratives have shifted. Why is
Right.
that?
Well, because Ukraine is losing, and the West doesn't want to admit that Ukraine is losing. If you recall, in January, before Kevin McCarthy took over, Nancy Pelosi invited President Volodymyr Zelensky to address the Congress. Zelensky shows up with a flag, a Ukrainian flag that had been signed in Bakhmut by the soldiers. And at that point, made a big deal about Bakhmut being something that they'd never give up. Well, they're giving it up. And the reason I posted what I did is if you go back 2-3 months ago, Bakhmut was described as strategically important. And in fact, it was being actually discussed as strategically important going back to last summer, because when Lysychansk and Seversk, when those fell, then the next line of defense was this line that stretched from Bakhmut, Mariinka in the south, Bakhmut, and then Solidar up north. Well, the Russians breached Solidar, and now they're in the process of taking out Bakhmut. After that, the next line of defense to the west is Kramatorsk and I think Severodonetsk. So that they are more indefensible than, say, Bakhmut and Solidar. And once they are gone, there's nothing standing in between Russia and the Dnieper River. So it basically will end up vanquishing all the Ukrainian forces from the Donbass region, both Luhansk and Donetsk. So that's what's going on in Bakhmut is absolutely horrific. The number of casualties that the Ukrainians are suffering is staggering. The Ukrainian line is that the Russians are the ones who are really suffering the casualties, but the Russians have sort of, and particularly the Wagner group that's carrying this out, have perfected a technique of using artillery, airstrikes, missiles, rockets to soften up fortified positions, and then to go in with tanks and infantry to take them out once they have been literally softened up. And Russia's in no rush. They have no clock that's ticking against them. Same can't be said for Ukraine and for the United States and NATO.
So, what is the status of Bakhmut as of today that we know?
The pincers, as they call it, the cauldron, it's closing. The line is getting steadily pushed back. The Ukrainians are talking about trying to mount a counteroffensive, and part of the problem there is the weather is going to turn against them as well. The thick mud of the Ukrainian countryside makes it virtually impassable to vehicles, including armored and tracked vehicles. So that their ability to organize a force and deploy it is limited. On top of that, the Russians are able to monitor the massing of Ukrainian forces and hit those forces actually before they deploy. Mm-hmm. So it's not a good situation. And it'd be one thing if the only fighting that was taking place was there in the Bakhmut area. But you've got farther south in Mariinka, which is on the outskirts, sort of the suburbs of Donetsk, the capital for the Donetsk Republic. This is going on there, fighting up north around Kharkov. So the entire line, most people don't realize that the length of this line of conflict is about 1,000 miles. It's like the distance from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, up to Washington, D.C., or the distance, if you will, from Paris to Warsaw. Poland. That's a long area. And I don't care if you've got a 1,000,000-man army massed along that kind of line. That means they're really quite dispersed. So this is not the scale of anything approaching World War II in terms of manpower. But when you look at it in those precise locations where the fighting is taking place, the violence is without parallel. We've not seen anything like this since World War II. And World War II, they did not have the kinds of destructive weapons that are now in the possession both of Russia and the Ukrainians.
Now, you quote from a piece in Forbes magazine by David Axe talking
Yes.
about how there are just 2 roads out of Bakhmut for Ukrainian troops. Russian forces are within rocket range of both of them, and that means that after 9 months of brutal fighting, the battle for Bakhmut is entering what could be its decisive phase. In the coming hours or days, it's possible one of 2 things will happen. The Russians advance so close to the 2 roads that the Ukrainians retreat in order to avoid encirclement, or the Ukrainians counterattack and push back the Russians. The former would resolve the long, awful fight over Bakhmut. The latter would prolong it. In any event, the ultimate outcome should be the same. Whether or not they capture the virtually lifeless ruins of Bakhmut, the Russians have expended a lot of their combat power, which appears to be exactly what the Ukrainians wanted. They apparently have used Bakhmut and the Kremlin's weird obsession with the town to bleed Russian forces, and in so doing, set the conditions for a long-planned spring offensive.
Yeah, I mean, the guy's delusional. They need to do a drug test on him right now to find out what sort of hallucinogens or mind-altering drugs he's taking. The obsession has been Ukraine, who has been pouring in manpower in numbers that we just have not seen, and they're getting chewed up. There have been Ukrainian sources that have reported that the expected lifespan of a new soldier introduced to that front line is 4 hours, not 4 days, not 4 weeks, 4 hours. That's how long you're going to last. There are some videos that I, up to this point, not posted that are absolutely horrific in terms of just the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers piled up that being hit by the artillery. That is the primary weapon of attack. We've been hearing since March of last year that Russia's running out of ammunition, Russia's running out of missiles, Russia can't keep doing this, Russia's on the ropes. Every month they keep saying that, and it's not true. What they don't address, and what is a reality, is the Russians have roughly 600,000 troops that are now on the border that have not yet entered. They've not been sent into battle. So what Russia's fighting with right now are some existing forces, particularly the Wagner group. They've not brought up any of the reserves that were called up starting last September. And in addition to those reserves, they had other people who volunteered. So the combination of reserves with experienced military personnel, as well as new personnel, who've been training now for, let's see, that's 5, going on like 7 months. That is a sufficient time to train up new units to be able to carry out combat activities.
So there is I guess, a continual PR push to try to make this look like it's the opposite of what's happening. What is the advantage of that? Is it just like with Afghanistan, where the American media and Western media just kept saying, we need another year there, just another year, just another year?
Because we're winning. And what I find so rich is you get a lot of some of my former colleagues. Jack Devine, he's a elderly gent, older than me by a good stretch. He's out talking about how the Russians couldn't even fight off goat herders in Afghanistan. Hello, was he paying attention to the United States in Afghanistan for the last 20 years? How did that turn out? I don't recall us waving the victory flag and having a march down Pennsylvania Avenue to celebrate our great victory over the ragheads and the goat herders. So, I mean, this American arrogance on this is just sickening to me, because it's dangerous. And as part of the danger, we end up grossly underestimating people like nations like Russia, and grossly overestimating our own capabilities. So as a result, we think that we could actually take on the Russians on their home territory and win, and that's not going to happen. Part of this goes back to that movie Patton in 1972. It's before your time, but I was around when it came out. I was just in high school. And at the end of the movie, Patton's talking about, we need to line up with the Germans and go after the Russians. Well, I remember at the time when I saw that, I endorsed that. I was, oh yeah, we need to do that. Need to go get the Russians, the Soviets at the time. Well, it's a whole new world, and we've got people from like Jack Devine who are locked into a Cold War vision of what the Soviet Union was, without realizing Russia's a completely different country now. Russia today is a Christian nation. Russia today rejects homosexuality. They reject child pornography. They reject transgender lifestyle as normal. They are in a traditional Christian vision that marriage is ordained by God of man and woman. And frankly, I think that is one of the reasons there is such great animus in the West, particularly in the United States, among the media elite, that because there are so many homosexuals in the media, that Russia's stance towards homosexuality is seen as something so repugnant that we have to destroy Russia over it. I mean, it may sound far-fetched, but I think there is a legitimate element to that motivation right now of what's driving just absolutely bizarre, crazy, detached from reality views of what Russia is today. Russia's not a dictatorship. Russia's not an authoritarian government. In fact, you can make a stronger case that you've got more government control of the media and more repression of certain political classes in the United States than you do in Russia.
How would you make that case that there's more repression in the media here than there is in Russia?
Okay. Remember Cy Hirsch's story about how did the New York Times cover that? No. Washington Post? No. How about PBS, NewsHour? No. How about National Public Radio? No.
Yeah.
CBS, NBC, ABC? No. Shut down. They controlled the information. It's not going to be talked about. Government. It's a form of government censorship.
Yeah, they also control like search engine results, because I was trying to look up sources on the 1990 promise to Russia to not move 1 inch eastward to the Warsaw Pact countries.
Right.
And Google's search results are stacked with all these propaganda lines saying, "Oh no, we didn't promise them a dang thing. We didn't promise them anything. We didn't,
and which is
it's
a
like,
straight up lie. Straight up lie.
Yeah, I found George Washington University archives where they released these transcripts just saying that very thing. All these different Western leaders promising not to go 1 inch eastward to the Warsaw Pact countries in 1990, but it was in an obscure academic archive that I had found on DuckDuckGo search engine. So it's pretty bleak, isn't it? You were living in kind of a North Korea-like environment.
Well, look at the number of people that have been imprisoned over the so-called January 6th insurrection. And if you saw Tucker Carlson last night, where Tucker did a fabulous job, because he got actual access to all of the videotape. And what you see in the videotape is that the most of the protesters, the vast majority of the protesters, were peaceful. They were not violent. They were not threatening destruction. And they were walking around and actually being escorted by Capitol Hill police as if they were tour guides. They were not, it was not a confrontation. So an entire lie was built up in order to attack Trump supporters. So this is what we've now entered an extremely dangerous time because of the incompetence of the Biden administration. Just this morning or overnight, the Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a very stark statement warning the United States that it was going to be, we're going to basically go to war with China. And it's one of those things that when you read it, it just I was shocked by it, because the Chinese normally are not prone to come out and say very harsh things. Listen to this. I was just looking for the quote. This is from the foreign minister of China. The Chinese people have the right to ask, why does the U.S. talk about respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity on the Ukrainian issue, but not respecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of China on the Taiwan issue? If the U.S. does not put on the brakes and continues on the wrong track, no barriers will be able to stop the train from derailing and overturning, and this will inevitably lead to confrontation and conflict. Such rivalry is a reckless adventure in which the fundamental interests of the two peoples and even the future of mankind are at stake. That's what the Chinese are now saying. The Chinese are now closely aligned with Russia, and the Biden team is trying to pick a fight with both.
I saw that there was to that point you had shared a news story that according to the results of February, for the first time in Russia, the most popular currency in trading was the yuan, right? So
yeah.
So that's a big change, right? From the
dollar. In order, so for years, both China and Russia were willing to play along. International financial system that was dominated by the United States, led by the United States, and that the dollar reigned supreme. They're now recognize that they're going to move. They're going to reject that system. They're going to move away. They can no longer trust the United States. They no longer want to be dependent upon the dollar.
So, do you see the sanctions that America has and interested in adding to China as leading to war, or do you think that
yes?
China...
Well, number one, we do not have a historical record of sanctions being effective in affecting political change. So when you look at the sanctions, history doesn't show sanctions as being effective in compelling regime change or change of government. If anything, it forces a change in the economic behavior of countries so that they'll seek alternatives. But in this case, the United States is utterly dependent upon China for many of its rare earth minerals that go into making, electric vehicles. Mm-hmm. More importantly, I think it's like 90% of our pharmaceuticals come out of China. So building material, computer chips. So we are picking a fight with somebody who is actually an essential supplier of ours. And yes, we are an important market for the Chinese, but if we're like someone that's literally cutting off their right arm to make a point. Right. I'll teach you. I'm going to cut my arm off.
Yeah.
Well, hello, that eliminates your arm and cripples you. So this is all tied together. This is what we're seeing is the end of U.S. leadership in the global economy, and world politics. The United States will still be an important player, but the era of U.S. dominance is over. That's what's coming to a screeching halt. And I think in this coming months, we're going to see the breakup of NATO, and U.S. influence overseas is going to be greatly diminished.
So is this by design? Because, there's a lot of competing theories as to what's motivating these so-called elites to do the things that they're doing, which you couldn't ask for a more hostile to the interest of the American people policy than the things they continue to pursue. Are they done with America? They want to, there's some people that say, like the conservative line about Obama that, he wanted to diminish America to make it part of a a globalist one world government system. They had to take America down several pegs in the whole system. Then others would say, no, these are just neocons who are so stupid they just do not even understand how impotent their strategy is for world domination, and it's just backfiring gloriously. Is it
I I
all of
I,
those things combined?
I would like it. I would say this is like the super size me, where the guy he ate the maximum amount of calories he could every day at McDonald's, and after a while, what did it cause? It caused weight gain. It caused terrible blood work, uh, putting him at risk of a heart attack. What we're seeing is the culmination of a U.S. I'll call it imperialist foreign policy that's now leading to its natural end. We have overstretched ourselves. And this really goes back 70 years. It started when the United States began intervening in Guatemala and Iran in the 1950s, followed up by our intervention in Vietnam, a war that cost almost 60,000 American lives, and no telling how many million Vietnamese died in that conflict. And then followed by our support for regimes in Central America, and then it goes on to two wars in Iraq and war in Afghanistan. We tried to overthrow the government of Bashar Assad. We did overthrow the government of Muammar Gaddafi. So what has happened is that the United States, in part, has created a military machine that has to be fed. And the only way you can feed it is you have to identify an enemy, a foreign enemy, that justifies why we need to continue to spend more on defense every year, regardless of whether Russia exists, Russia doesn't exist, global terrorism, no longer global terrorism. Now it's Russia and China, the threats are back. We need to keep spending more. And that expense goes, but without the results on the ground, because these foreign military adventures don't wind up making us stronger. If anything, it has weakened us. We've
Right.
spent literally trillions of dollars overseas that could have been spent building infrastructure, building new railroads, building high-speed rail systems, improving airports, just building new bridges. The list goes on. Not to mention trying to bring some order to our inner cities, where children are growing up in literal war zones that are more dangerous than anything in the Donbass right now. And as a result, you got kids that they're largely minority who don't know how to read, don't know how to write, don't know how to do math. They become uneducated. But it's also happening to non-minority children. So when the United States is faced with that, and yet we tried just 2 years ago to overthrow the government in Belarus of Lukashenko, and then we just tried about a year ago to overthrow the government in Kazakhstan. So the United States there's no other country that meddles more in the internal affairs of other countries than the United States. And we'd always do it in the claim that we're pursuing our national interest. It's insanity. And so that's what's coming home. Those chickens are coming home to roost. And we have now overstretched ourselves. We've picked a fight with Russia that we cannot win. There is nothing we can do that could achieve victory in Russia, including trying to start a nuclear war. We would lose that. And Americans don't want to hear that. And I'm certainly not advocating for a nuclear war, but the Russians are in a much stronger position. And yet we see constantly we're told how inept, incompetent, backwards the Russian military is, Russian technology, Russian economy. But just 2 weeks ago, the International Space Station, the return aircraft, it had a leak, and part of it was destroyed. The astronauts are trapped. What are we going to do to get the astronauts back? The Russians sent up a robot spaceship, goes up, docks with the space station, and it's going to bring those astronauts home. The United States has no such capability. And yet we're to believe that the Russians are backwards. The Russian children exceed our children by years in terms of math, science, geometry, trigonometry skills, biology. That's why in Russia you don't see any of this stupidity about transgenderism, because they recognize there is a scientific principle called biology. There are things male and female. And just because a female claims that she is now a male is, she can claim she's a potato, doesn't make her a potato either.
Yeah. You've got a clash of culture, a clash of religions going on with these civilizations. Darren Beatty says, he's at Revolver News. He says, it is increasingly clear, for better or worse, that intensifying Cold War with China is inevitable. The underlying conditions for there to be any meaningful resistance to this from the anti-war right or the regime critical right are simply non-existent. The cattle cannot resist the rhetoric. To ask them to resist would almost be unfair. And there is complete interest convergence on the elite side, from Soros to Pompeo to big tech.
Yeah. No, I'd agree. This, because you extend beyond the war in Ukraine and the U.S. efforts to, basically attack and pray that Vladimir Putin goes away. Again, it's one of those. This is the let's call it the non-religious view of Manichaeism. The Manichaean view was light and dark, good and evil. So the U.S. foreign policy is always predicated on we got to have a villain, and we always, just like within Christianity, you got to have Satan.
Yeah.
Now and then in the secular world, we got Hitler, we got Stalin, we got Pol Pot, we got Saddam Hussein, we got Manuel Noriega, we got Vladimir Putin. Without recognizing that those societies are much more than one individual. And that, in fact, if you remove that individual, that doesn't necessarily alter the society or alter the culture. It really is sort of a childish, juvenile approach that we've adopted here in the United States. That is our common. As long as we can create a personified enemy with a face, then that's how we rally the American people and get them to spend all sorts of money that they don't have.
Wow.
And that this notion that Vladimir Putin, I literally heard this character, Jack Devine, former CIA officer on the operations side, he compared Vladimir Putin with Adolf Hitler. Now, that is as stupid a statement as I've ever heard. It reflects, one, gross ignorance of history, no understanding whatsoever of what Hitler actually was and what he did. And then to compare Vladimir Putin to that, Putin is really the antithesis of Hitler, if anything. But again, it goes back to that we've got to demonize a person, create that villain in order to rally the American people.
So what do you think happens if America doesn't have nuclear attack, or if it doesn't change its general posture towards China and Russia and other countries? What is it going to look like in 10 years here?
We're going to be destroyed. Russia and China right now can hit us with conventional missiles that will make DC inoperable, and the flow of money will stop. People depending on Social Security will no longer have Social Security. It'll completely disrupt our nation's economy.
Do you think that's in their long-term plan to do that? If they have,
no, they're not planning to do that. They're going to react to what we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
See, we're the ones threatening. Again, as the Chinese correctly noted, the United States is supplying lethal weapons to the Ukrainians that the Ukrainians are using to kill Russians. We've provided lethal equipment that has been used to carry out terrorist attacks inside Russia. How would we react if Russia gave the Mexicans lethal weapons and they carried out terrorist attacks in the United States?
Yeah.
Not only would we be outraged, we would see that as an act of war by Russia. Well, guess what? Russia sees it the same way, only it's an act of war by us on Russia, and Russia will respond accordingly. Same for the Chinese. Since 1972, the United States has acknowledged, as a result of President Richard Nixon's trip to China, that Taiwan is a province of China. It's not an independent country. It's not an independent nation. It is not something distinct from and separate from China. That's been our policy. That's what we told the Chinese. Now we're changing it. We're changing, oh, Taiwan, it deserves its independence, and we're going to start providing weapons to Taiwan. Well, what do you think? How would we react if during the Civil War, the nations of Great Britain decided to start supplying the Confederacy with cannon and muskets and advanced weaponry? That would be an act of war. And that's exactly what the United States is attempting to do in Taiwan. And that's why it's going to lead to the Chinese punching back. And I think, frankly, it puts the very survival of the United States at risk, and it's our own doing. It's not because foreign adversaries, Russia and China together, have not been invading other countries outside of, they've been clearly worried about countries on their border, just as we are. But we, by contrast, the United States, we've been invading countries around the world without permission of the United Nations. Yeah. Iraq twice, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Ethiopia, Yemen, the list goes on. So at some point, you got to look in the mirror and realize, you know what? We're the bad guys. We've done this.
How do you think that the American people's public opinion on these conflicts has a big impact on this at this point, or is it pretty much null and void? Like if the American people were to wake up to what you're saying, would that actually impact DC, or are they so impenetrably, you see what they're doing with shenanigans with elections and creating these types of Fedsurrections type things with January 6th. They seem to have shifted away from any kind of pretense of being a rule of law republic and embracing imperial dictatorship style governance. I mean, at this point, does it really matter if the American people were to be publicly against this and say, 70% say stay out of Ukraine and all that?
Yeah, no, actually public opinion would matter greatly. But what's happened up to this point is the government has so skillfully manipulated public opinion. And I saw this on the lead up to the war in Iraq in 2003, when the American people were lied to. They were told by people like Lori Milroy, who were being supported by a lot of the neoconservatives, that Saddam Hussein was behind the 9/11 attacks. It was not. It was a lie. That Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and was preparing to use those against the United States. That was a lie. But the American people were sold that as a lie. You had people like Dick Cheney telling it to us. You had Judith Miller at the New York Times reporting it, and people swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. Next thing you know, we're in a war in Iraq where we kill hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, if not more. And what do we accomplish at the end of the day? We spent $1 trillion of U.S. money that we'll never get back on what was really a failed military effort. So that's why you've got to really be, having shows like yours, an alternative voice, to get away from the traditional media. You just need to recognize the media lies. That generally they are liars, and that's what they do.
You used to go. You posted a blog where you said you used to go on Keith Olbermann and Larry King and those types of.
Sure.
What was going on back then that they gave you a platform, and why don't they give you a platform now?
Well, this was in the heyday of terrorist attacks. So I was a terrorism talking head because of my past experience working in the Office of Counterterrorism and my continued work at the time with the U.S. military special operations forces in scripting terrorism exercises. So whenever there was a terrorist event or terrorist incident, I'd get called up. This was, I did Crossfire with Bob Novak and Bill Press, Geraldine Ferraro. I did Nightline with Ted Koppel. I was frequently on the Jim Lehrer News Hour. Did Larry King, did Keith. I did everyone. But they stopped inviting me to come on when I began attacking Barack Obama and commenting upon his lack of qualifications to be president. At that point, I became persona non grata with the establishment media. That's okay. That's why God created blogs.
Yeah. Your blog's got a lot of comments and traffic, looks like.
Yeah.
Why do you think it is that they had the Islamic War on Terror and they kept telling people who criticized America's policies in that conflict, they would say, you're a terrorist sympathizer for the radical Islamists?
Mm-hmm.
And then it turned out that America was subsidizing and funding Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra and ISIS all along, it seems like. And now the same playbook we see in Ukraine, where they say, if you are against the Ukraine war, you're a white supremacist neo-Nazi. And yet they're the ones that trained and aided and helped Azov and all these other groups for years. That's a similar playbook. They like to project their sins onto their anti-war critics, don't they?
They accuse you of what they are doing. It's that simple. So we've seen this over and over, and it is unfortunate. It's unfortunate, but it is the reality.
Well, hopefully the American people will eventually have the ability to see through it. They do now. They just have to snap out of it. Yeah. Thank you, Larry Johnson, for joining me. And I want folks to check out your website, sonar21.com, for more of your insights like you've shared with us today.
Thanks, Dave. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Very good. Talk to you soon.